Great. Thank you all so much. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here today and to be in person, which seems a really rarefied pleasure these days. So thank you. This talk offers a broad engagement with Nisus Formativus in its 1791 English translation. The talk has 3 sections. And the first situates my engagement with the Blumenbach project and some of the ways I think that questions we're discussing here impact the wider study of early modern European life science. The second indicates some residual presences of early modern scholarship in this facet of Blumenbach's project. The third elaborates one such early modern problem, that of monsters and mules, together understood as a human influence on nature, and to some degree, and asks a few questions to situate these issues in the wider theory of the Nisus Formativus. Here I will lay out some questions for future research on which I hope very much you will advise me. This, I think, is a very particular conference. So many of us came to our studies, whether of the sciences or the humanities, through an obsession with universal questions. Who are we? What are we meant to do? And indeed, the question central to our conversations today, which is, what is life? However, those perennial questions are notoriously difficult to answer. We historians of science often sidestep those issues. Why not focus on something we can know? Objects, networks, publication dates, places, political commitments, render finite transcendent ideas. Through them, we can claim command over some corner of history. But the format of this conference, insofar as I understand it, aims to push us both to read Blumenbach as a historical thinker and to step into metabiography, engaging with the same questions that motivated his idea of de Nisus Formativus. With our visits to the collections, I imagine that we can also find ourselves thinking about how these abstract writings related to Blumenbach's materially focused studies, commitment to collecting, and engagement with the scholarly setting. We will then oscillate between abstraction and physicality, between the motivating questions at the center of thought and life, and the exacting details of history and living matter. I hope you will forgive me to be here as an interloper. My expertise is in the 16th and 17th century Spanish Empire and Renaissance Italy. In that context, I've worked a bit on the problem of animal generation. Much of my work has aimed at dispelling the idea that Renaissance theorists and practical experts in science embraced a static view of nature and humanity. Many mile-high narratives in the history of science contend that it took until the 1740s for thinkers to critique a theologically driven narrative that saw nature as static and species as permanent across time. For evidence, they cite the great chain of being, that trope of linear hierarchical organization of beings from mineral to divine. One need only look at theories of José de Acosta on species change and migration, or gander at the writings surrounding Renaissance breeding projects, or glance at a report on the potential for extinction and transformation of human and non-human animal populations in rural colonial Mexico, in order to dispel the idea that this was comprehensively held in the 16th century. So, when Blumenbach resists the Linnaean notion of a single trait taxonomy in favor of a sweeping force, I read him as, in some ways, returning to some of the interdisciplinary dexterity and lateral thinking that was also apparent, though in different ways, in Renaissance thought. Consistent with this deeper history of thought on animal generation, Blumenbach's library indicates intellectual engagement with the 16th and 17th century Italian context. I've collected here some of the titles as recorded in the 1840 sales catalog. Among many more recent volumes, of course, on natural history, these do include the writings of Italian anatomist Vesalius, the equine anatomical work of Carlo Ruini, the writings of Fabricius Agorpendente, and the embryological writings of Marcello Malpighi. Blumenbach was not alone in these connections. For instance, von Haller's ruminations on epigenesis in 1744 connect directly to Malpighi, which in turn connect to earlier fonts. Haller's work delineates an 18th century debate between epigenesis and preformationists, spermists and ovists. Like Blumenbach, who would deploy cutting ironies and questions in his rhetorical approach, Haller asked questions. How are the bodies of men and plants fabricated? Is it by soul or some plastic potency? Is it by epigenesis, particles of alignment uniting in accordance with some mechanical laws to form the prescribed fabric of their own species? Amid these questions, Haller then drew on the embryological work of Malpighi into the history of evolution. He concluded that the theory of evolution proposed by Swammerdam and Malpighi prevails almost everywhere. Indeed, part of Blumenbach's intellectual project seems to be a disregard for this type of precedent. While he still abided by some of the rules for reasoned debate that have some of their foundations in humanistic writing, he followed an Enlightenment trend to create an analytical tabula rasa on which to build afresh. From what I have read of Blumenbach's racial and anti-racial categorization, there are similar threads that pervade both of these analytical projects. It is a credit to your collective project that a Renaissance scholar like myself can even engage with such questions and come to her own conclusions on the Blumenbach archive. I came across your scholarship while working for materials to teach at Hamilton, where I offered a course on race science and the origins of the modern world. We ventured into Blumenbach Online, which rendered this German language material readily accessible to Anglophone undergraduates. My contribution then in this presentation today is to think about Blumenbach not as a calling card for modernity, but in some ways as a watershed thinker within early modern philosophy. Indeed, insofar as the nisus formativus is a key part of the story of modern biology, it also has early modern roots. For instance, Blumenbach's references popular ideas of alchemy. He followed the Aristotelian prompt to ruminate on the significance of the mule question. Work as a physician informed his natural history. He followed changing ideas of wonder in the order of nature to reference Daston and Park's monster book. Theories of nature slipped quickly into popular imagination. And on that front, Blumenbach noted that just after Swammerdam published his results on non-human animal research, human examples that seemed to substantiate the theory appeared too. Young girls became pregnant from the, quote, untimely and premature evolution of one of those organized germs, end quote. A miller's wife gave birth to a baby who was herself pregnant with a baby. Curiosity motivated popular engagement with matters of life. And it was to these wayward hypotheses that Blumenbach's sharp critique was directed. Although sometimes remiss in crediting their ideas, Section 1 does engage with requisite thinkers from antiquity, though they often act as straw men. Renaissance-style allusions to eminent thinkers pepper the ends of paragraphs, both for clarification and rhetorical flair. However, Blumenbach seems keen to take up the mantle of iconoclasm. He is like Newton, but unlike authors from the, quote, darkest times of the Middle Ages, quote, who suffered from the lethargy of monastic barbarism, in his words. Blumenbach cites Drelincourt's collection of 252 vague hypotheses of generation and sums up several editions of his own. Despite the fame associated with their names, Hippocrates and Heraclitus come off as sounding particularly foolish in Blumenbach's telling of their theory of generation by roving genitals. He joins with Gessner in concluding that, quote, it is the chimeras of the ancients the chimera of the ancients were just as good as those of the moderns. In discussion of irritability, he argues that there were no ancient precedents. He explains sarcastically, quote, I should be extremely happy, however, if any person would name one of the old writers who, in describing the vis plastica, has given such a distinct idea of it, or one that corresponds so well to the study of generation. Lacunae in preceding thought validated the ingenuity of his theory. Blumenbach's project in the Nisus Formativus spoke to perennial questions. After laying out the debate between epigenesis and evolution in the first section of the text, Blumenbach starts to establish his own argument. Of course, in the period under question, the term evolution was intended to portray the embryological development of a single individual, not the overall development of life on Earth, to quote Peter Bowler. In his account, Blumenbach follows first the roving genitals theory of evolution and then the semen theory of evolution, which held that the first parent of each animal and plant was supposed to contain all germs of successive generations. He then takes up the ovary theory in which, quote, all children of Adam ipso facto pent up in the two ovaria of our common mother Eve, end quote. He ends, of course, with space for his own intervention. Through the Nisus Formativus, Blumenbach offered a way around what I see to be the horns of a century-old dilemma. Despite its many observational challenges, forms, and aberrations, Blumenbach contended that reproduction and generation followed clear laws, as our wonderful introduction here stipulated. He wrote that there was no such thing in nature as pre-existing organized germs, but that unorganized matter of generation, after being duly prepared and having arrived at its place of destination, takes on a particular action or nisus, which nisus continues to act through the whole life of an animal, and that by the first form of animal or plant is not only determined, but afterwards preserved when the deranged is again restored. To articulate this unifying theory, Blumenbach then drew on experimental examples from across nature, from plants to animals to humans. Although microscopy and experimental approaches whittled down the wilder theories of life's origins, vestiges of an early modern scientific culture of curiosity shaped his inquiry. As a thinker working in the wake of Newton, Blumenbach sought the laws for the nisus. Newton's gravity was an occult property which acted mysteriously, if quantifiably at a distance, without any obvious physical mechanism. If Newton could define the laws of attraction, then Blumenbach sought to lay out the laws of nature, likewise defined by ratios, if not formulaic inverse square laws. These were broad, but perhaps could be quantified. First, of course, is this inverse ratio to the age of an organized body. The second is how the nisus acted on embryos and mammalia differently than on oviparous animals. And third, in some parts of the organized body, Blumenbach contended that the nisus was more regular than in others. Activity developed differently when one species of organic body acted as another, or when structures of generation resembled the other sex, or finally, and most importantly for the conclusion of this talk, when the formative process takes on action that was preternatural to the individual. More generally, when Blumenbach's critiques of preceding thinkers are clear, these rules remain a bit opaque to me, and perhaps some of the subsequent talks will shed more light on their implications. Put simply, Blumenbach's work sought to trace generation beyond a singular model, that of the chicken and the egg. Section 2 launches vitriolically into a takedown of Haller's 1758 paper and descriptions of the yolk of chickens before impregnation. This section includes Fabricius and Malpighi's research. Quote, the modern advocates for the theory of evolution have taken this observation of the yolk of the egg as prop in their hypotheses, end quote. Blumenbach contended that Malpighi and Crane had assured us that they had seen the embryo of the chick with its appendices in the egg of a trod hen before the hen had been sate upon, end quote. Microscopy certainly revealed new facets of nature, but it also perpetuated the illusion of preceding arguments for the structures of nature in even smaller matter. And we continue with this change in animal and plant models. Blumenbach then moves away from the egg alone to think through healing. He notes the ectopic pregnancy in which the fetus is calcified to save a mother, or a new elbow created after an arm's break, or a new socket for a thigh. Rather than turning back to chickens and mating for offspring, Blumenbach sought a more expansive connective idea of generation and reproduction that sees self-repairing nature as part of the same process. In his words, generation and reproduction are both modifications of the same power, and the last being nothing else than a partial repetition of the first. He concludes, if perfect bones and new preternatural joints and new and organized vascular membranes can be formed where there is no ground for the supporting pre-existing germ, what necessity is there for this doctrine of development? In the end, Blumenbach was more committed to the model of the polyp, the self-healing over the spectacle of insemination. The polyp had a beauty, for in it there was no occasion for new material, but the fixing of a disturbed structure. Indeed, the polyp's reproductive power in this way was more expensive than that of humans and warm bloods. Blumenbach creates an origin story for the nisus formativus. This is less of an apple striking one's head of a kind of moment, rather than a quick transition from the countryside of experimentation. The polyp's ability to regenerate to a human patient, which carries on the lower end the femur, causing an ulcer. After spending a country holiday maiming a polypus to the delight of his country friends, Blumenbach returned to town where he saw the patient. He noted that the wound gradually healed by proportion, and as the wound filled up, a cicatrix formed and other portions sunk. In these two very different scenarios and contexts, Blumenbach saw likenesses. He wrote, quote, "This was exactly the same thing as mutatis mutandis, with what happened in the polypus as it regenerated smaller animals around its mutilated rump." This temporal juxtaposition encourages Blumenbach to think comparatively. Something, perhaps the same force, caused the wound to heal, if imperfectly, and the polyp's truncated body and butchered stumps to make new, smaller, but autonomous organisms. The analytical implications of such a context change is familiar. I found myself thinking of Marcello Malpighi's winter 1687 correspondence with the Veronese physician Stefano Piccioli. One of Piccioli's patients had suffered a penile ulcer that had been caused by a severe infestation of worms. Piccioli wrote, "Meanwhile, I did not know where such a large number of eggs could have been deposited there, such that if they were kept warm in a fertile womb." This was a mystery about where so many kind of animals had come from, if not from generated from the decaying fresh. So perhaps Olson's essay will be able to comment on the presence of spontaneous generation in this type of period philosophy. Tobacco provided the experimental model for Blumenbach's response to the Aristotelian mule question. Aristotle had asked in the pages on generations of animals why the mule produced by a horse and ass is particularly sterile, whereas the offspring of a male and female horse or male and female ass is not sterile. Of course, there are many iterations on this debate, and Blumenbach himself evaded those terms by moving away again from versions of chickens and eggs and mammalian reproduction. Instead, he cited the tobacco hybridization experiments of Kohlreuter as the ultimate proof that one species could be transformed into another. To cite Christine Leitler, quote, "There was another physiologist from Göttingen, being Blumenbach, who established epigenesis in the 1780s as the leading model of generation and helped the idea of an active organizing power, the nisus formativus, to gain traction well beyond the confines of embryology. She has argued that Kohlreuter assigned his language of seeds with alchemy, thereby seeing plant reproduction as the unification of two seed matters. Through this, Kohlreuter explained that hybrids displayed features from both parents and tapped into a process of generation that included vital forces. With this, human breeders could be creators. If alchemical thought held that lead could be transformed into gold, Kohlreuter aimed to transform one plant into another. I would very much like to hear those more expert in this corpus than I perhaps reflect on the presence of alchemical thinking in Blumenbach's larger writing. An essay on generation subtly normalizes its logic by folding it into a joke at the expense of Spallanzani and his observations of tadpoles. That Spallanzani could think that little black points in both fecundated and unfecundated spawn had a particular type of illogic to Blumenbach. He skewered this antecedent, writing, quote, "I do not know what would be thought of that chemist who asserted that the arbor diani pre-existed in a massive amalgam of silver, because when a weak solution of silver was poured onto it, a little tree seemed to spring out of it." Of course, Blumenbach did prominently feature Coleridge at the end of section 2. He intended to use the generation of mules as a final nail in the coffin of his argument, to refute all of our pre-existing organic germs. Blumenbach framed Coleridge's production of, quote, bastard plants from rustica and another version of tobacco by recounting the study, a complete metamorphosis of one natural species of plant into another. Coleridge, by Blumenbach's telling, had artificially impregnated the first species of tobacco with the farina of the last mentioned. From there, he obtained prolific bastard seeds, and when seeds sprung from those plants, he repeated the same experiment anew. Finally, after the result of all of this, 6 plants appeared to resemble the paniculate tobacco, or the paniculate nicotine. The English translation represents this as a transformation that would be so complete that the new plants had not the smallest resemblance to the maternal plant. Through human intervention in the process of fertilization, one could seemingly make one species of tobacco from another, newly kindred. Citing this experiment, Blumenbach contended the theory of performed germs decayed before one's eyes. I'll end, as Blumenbach did, with monsters. In his final caveat for the Nisus formativus, he considered its impact in cases that were preternatural to the individual. Monsters, he thought, were more alike than different. They've deviated by fixed laws, writing, quote, "Whoever has seen any considerable number of monsters, or only looked into the loose and wretched complications of representations of them, can hardly have escaped being struck by the resemblance which unites even the most inconsiderable parts, certain species of them, so that the individuals of that species seem as if they have all been cast in the same mold." What was more, monsters with 2 bodies and a single head were thought to be more common in animals which have been domesticated, rather than in their wild state. While controlled breeding seemed to render mules a species, it came with a cost. Tinkering potentially changed the results. Blumenbach had already suggested on the natural variety of mankind that in domestic animals, when man had been subdued through enslavement, one could change in character. He ended, but in Nisus formativus, he ends by noting, quote, "On the one hand, there is nothing unreasonable in supposing that after the subjugation of these animals, their whole frame and economy suffer from a very great change. That then the formative Nisus deviates in some degree from its original laws, and therefore these animals degenerate into the endless varieties and are some more subjected to monstrosity." Domestication, that ancient means of taming nature to suit human life through breeding, seemed at once to offer lessons for those interested in the organization of features of life, and perhaps often a rebuke for the hegemony. I end the paper capaciously with monsters and mules. While in this last section, I have explored questions of domestication, I have ultimately sought to root Blumenbach's project in a larger early modern one. That context was more sophisticated, multifaceted, and enduring in its influence. What is notable in Nisus formativus is as much what it contains as that which is new. Precedents lingered on, despite Blumenbach's desire to dispel them. These included a culture of collecting, concern about monstrosity, the enduring problem of hybridity, and alchemical thinking. Unresolved questions that would prompt other generations to look anew at the birds and the bees. Thank you very much.